Church family, one more time, I tell you, I have looked so forward to every one of these lectures. I especially look forward to this session because I know you have a number of questions. I know you have a number of suggestions, and our speaker is so gracious to field these questions. He has written questions and oral questions. If you turned in the written questions, he'll be going over those, but if you have some questions and you want to raise your hand and so forth, we're going to have some men with microphones to come to you so your question can be heard as well as your answer. Our speaker.
So I think I probably... Good. That's good. I blame Brandy for that. I think she somehow has caused this. Oh, speaking of, here we go. Okay. Okay. All right, let's try to plow through these really fast, right? Because there's a lot. I don't want to not address anything. Okay, one of the questions that just came in is how many experiments have been done to simulate the flood, and is there a way to have an experiment to recreate it in a closed system? I don't think it'd be a good idea to totally simulate the flood in reality, right? But what's going on is you have small scale simulation, so to speak, whenever certain catastrophic things happen. Like Mount St. Helens has been a place where, like when the eruptions happened in the 80s, creationists did big studies of the effects of that. So it's on kind of a small scale, the effects of one aspect of the flood and what that would do. That's probably the best kind of real world simulation. The problem is you got to take Mount St. Helens and multiply it by thousands, okay, in order to really get an idea of what's going on. And that's just the volcanic aspect of the flood. Now, otherwise, the simulations going on in the flood are computer simulations. There's a lot of computer simulation work. I'm assuming this was your question because you brought it. There's a lot of computer simulation going on. And in fact, that's a fascinating part of creation science. There is one or two computer engineers in the creation science community that are professors. Like one of them is now at what's the big school there in Virginia that is I think it's in Virginia. Not Virginia Tech. This is more of like a Christian oriented. It's massive. Yeah, it's probably I think it's Liberty where he's at now, where he takes students and they do as they're doing their computer science work. They actually do flood simulations of different aspects of the flood. And so that's exciting stuff going on. And some of the development of catastrophic plate tectonics was computer simulations using the creation scientist constraints to see what would happen. Right now, there's John Baumgartner is doing simulations on the effects of tsunamis and how that affects erosion and the spread of sediment across the continents and so forth. And all of this is presented at creation conferences and then written in peer-reviewed journals among the creation science. A lot of people, it's one of the most ridiculous things. Somebody, in fact, just in the last few months, wrote on AP on our Facebook page, creation scientists, you guys, if you think your ideas are worth anything, you'll need to be getting your stuff peer-reviewed. And I'm like, we do. We have a peer-review system. Oh, well, then y'all must not, actually review each other and actually agree, combat each other. Y'all just must kind of give it a soft stamp and let it through. And I'm like, dude, you do not know what you're talking about. In fact, I have seen among creation scientists the most unchristian, hatred towards each other in the creation science community. I mean, there is serious argumentation. So whenever a theory comes out on top, it has gone through rigorous work in order for that to stand the test of time. So anyway, we've got a very intense peer review process. So the things that I'm presenting to you this weekend is taking the things that I feel like are the best arguments that have withstood good peer review before coming and trying to present those things as legitimate possibilities. Somebody wrote the Isaiah scroll is dated 100 to 300 BC and is a good resource to support the Bible. Is this dating in question or is a different method used? I don't know specifically about the Isaiah scroll, but But the dating aspect, if they dated it using carbon dating, where they take a piece of, say, the papyrus and do some carbon dating with that, carbon dating, C14 dating, can usually be considered to be reasonable and reliable back to about 1000 BC to 1500 BC. And then the nuclear decay rates are still accelerated from the flood. We think it's an exponential decay starting at the flood. The decay rates are extremely accelerated. So you're getting hundreds of millions of years of nuclear decay within the single year of the flood. After the flood, it starts to calm down exponentially. So you still can't trust any of the dates, even in carbon dating, until it gets down to about 1500 to 1000 BC. And then you start being able to rely on carbon dating. It fits the biblical model and so forth without a problem. So assuming that's what the Isaiah scroll is dated to be, which sounds like it is, that's probably an acceptable date. Marine organisms, I think there were a couple questions asking about marine organisms. How do they survive the flood? So the text does not, it's very clearly does not include fish being brought on the ark. So they survive. At least a bunch of them, of course, get wiped out, but some of them we know survive. And so then the question is just how that would happen. And so away from the divergent zones, if you get creatures out away from those divergent zones, then there's a lot less danger to any of the species that are out there. We have evidence that there would have been layers of, did you know that there's actually strata in the ocean? Different layers of salinity, for example. And that's one of the ways that we use to explain how freshwater and saltwater fish could have survived, assuming that they were that distinct at the time of the flood. But if they were, and that's questionable, I could talk about that, but then they could actually be surviving in different salt levels. So we see that, for example, at places where fresh water meets salt water, it'll create layers of salt versus fresh water, and you find fresh versus salt waters living above each other in different layers. So marine organisms obviously did survive the flood, even though they would not have been on the ark. Okay, if there were 215 billion people pre-flood, how did more human remains not become fossilized? So a lot of the questions have to do with the question of how come there were no human remains found in the flood layers and several like that. A layman's explanation of why no human fossils are found in flood layers. The emphasis there is layman explanation. I don't know if there's a hint going on there or not. Okay, so thinking about that whole issue. So I mentioned in the last session, or was it to somebody that asked a question? I don't remember. That the flood, the fossil record appears to be a record from bottom to top of the progression of the flood, wiping out habitats, so separate habitats. Okay, so the entire, like the marine floor creatures, and then the fish get picked up. And by the way, once the fish show up, they then are in all the layers above them, just as you'd expect in the flood. You got marine fossils all of a sudden randomly throughout the rest once they show up. And then it moves towards the coast, and so it's wiping out habitats. There's one whole habitat missing. It's not just the one that has humans. It's everything that lives with humans. It's basically the main habitat that is the dominant one today. And it includes the larger mammals. They don't show up in the flood layers. So your bears and dogs and cats, as well as your angiosperm plants. So your flower-bearing plants, fruits and so forth, instead the gymnosperms are prominent, and that appears to be what the dinosaurs are eating, at least the herbivore ones are eating, because that is the dominant ones in that habitat where the dinosaurs were found. But the angiosperms don't explode onto the scene until after the flood. Now, so what it appears to be then is that it's not just the humans that are gone. There's an entire habitat that is missing from the flood layers. All right, so let's step back and just think what could be going on here. From a theological standpoint, what's the purpose of the flood? God is wanting to wipe out humanity and, in fact, all flesh. And there is some debate over whether that is because he says that all flesh has corrupted its way, and that may be more than just the humans, because that term for all flesh is also used to describe the rest of the animals in the context. So even the animals had become corrupted, apparently, from the way God designed them. Now, does that have to do with the way humans are interacting with them? We don't know, but he wants all of them wiped out. Now, if he wants to, in the case of the humans, though, wipe all that immorality, they're the ones being immoral. He wants to wipe that out, and he needs a total reset. He wouldn't even want you to know what was the pre-flood humans doing. Like, aren't you kind of curious? If every intention was only evil continually, what did that look like? You know, there's kind of a curious part of you, like, what were they doing that was worse than what we see today, or even in Sodom and Gomorrah? I mean, well, he doesn't want archaeologists and paleontologists to be able to get down there and dig down there and figure that out. He needs to obliterate the entire human habitat. So theologically, I would expect he's got to totally obliterate that and start over. So how do you do that is the question. You can't just take the humans unless he's just going to miraculously start grabbing them. He's got to take the entire habitat where they live, okay, which is like we do today, and with among the angiosperms and the birds and the larger mammals. And so how are you going to ultimately be able to do that? Well, I would suggest that, there's another thing about this too. Based on how the fossil record is organized, what we surmise, the creation paleontologists, is that the pre-flood world seemed to have been less scattered like we are today, where all the animals, everything's kind of mixed. So everything comes off the ark, and everything's mixed, and we just kind of go over and fill the whole planet. But before the flood, it all seems to be broken up by habitat. There seems to be natural barriers somehow keeping the different habitats from mixing, because each of the habitats are getting wiped out separately without mixing from the other ones. So you can start thinking, okay, so was the original Rodinia, was it more kind of like islands, or was there some kind of barriers that kept one group from mixing with the others? We don't really know. But the fact that the habitats are so broken up suggests they're separate. So the human, mammal, angiosperm, most of the birds are separate. How do you wipe that out? Well, you wipe it out if it's at a subduction zone, because then it just goes straight down into the mantle. So when we look down, and remember I showed you the chart that shows the enormous amount of cooler slabs of material under the subduction zones. Some of that could be the human habitat. So again, that is theologically, that's the way you can do that. With catastrophic plate tectonics, you basically have a Korah, Dathan, and Abiram situation. Right? Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, that biblical incident where God opens up the earth, swallows down Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and his whole family. They get wiped out. Right? So that is what we're talking about. You would have that whole habitat at a subduction zone. So when all the fountains of the great deep break open, the plates break apart, the humans could have been at a subduction zone and immediately gone down into the mantle, which actually would have been very gracious of God to do, because it means you die quickly. You don't have to deal with everything that happens after that over the next 5 months. Right? The dinosaurs are still alive by the time the flood finally starts wiping their habitat out. And the reason we know that is because we find their footprints. Like out there in Wyoming, where I was studying dinosaur excavation, Kurt Wise told me about a place where you see out there these T-Rex footprints, and you can tell that it's running. Okay, it's because the gate is so far, and all of a sudden you see this fossilized slide, like where he slips and there's some reason a lot of water and mud. He slips, and you see the imprint of his side hit the ground, and then he gets up and keeps running. He's like hauling. He's trying to get away from something. All right, so they're alive that's the late stages of the flood. They're still alive to see everything that's gone on before they start getting obliterated by the power of those earthquakes and so forth out there. All right, but if the humans are at one of these subduction zones, and they basically die right away, and there's no time for them to do much scattering into the other habitats as their zone is getting wiped out. So that's kind of where we're at on that. Again, the Bible doesn't say anything about this. What we're doing is using the physical evidence we have and trying to work through the implications of that. Okay. So I'm not don't quote me as saying all of that. What I just said is true. We know that with certainty because we don't. We're treading into very theoretical. But from an apologetic standpoint, all we have to do is have a reasonable explanation that fits with our model, that makes it where our model's not hasn't been disproven. That's a reasonable explanation about what could have happened based on our model. All right, someone said, is there scripture that supports dinosaurs were on the ark with Noah? Let's see here. I was going to show some slides, but let me kind of walk through this here. So dinosaurs were apparently in their own habitat before the flood, and the reason we know they had to have been alive when the flood started is if we're right about what are the flood layers. Okay, the Cambrian up to the top of the Cretaceous. The dinosaurs are in those layers and they're alive. That means they're alive when the flood starts. So as land creatures, they're on the ark because the text is clear about that. So representatives of the dinosaurs have to be on the ark. So then the question is, well, how do you fit a creature that's as big as this building on the ark? And the answer is they don't start out that big. I have a replica sauropod eggs at AP. They start out like the Titanosaur starts out in an egg about that big. And it is very reasonable to suggest that God would have sent juveniles to Noah. Why? Well, of course, they're smaller, so they take up less space. They're a lot easier to manage, take a lot less food, make a lot less waste. But more importantly, they're going to live longer after the flood. Why does that matter? Because they've got to be able to spread out and repopulate the earth. You don't want old creatures that aren't going to live as long. So it's logical that God is going to want juveniles on the ark for so many reasons. So juvenile dinosaurs don't take up a lot of space. So from the fossil record, we surmise they had to have been on the ark. But then you find lots of evidence that the dinosaurs are around after the flood. We find, for example, the legends that have been passed down, including accounts from respected historians like Josephus and Marco Polo and individuals who encountered some of these and tell about the stories. And you, of course, know the legends of dragons that go back even all the way back to the time period right after the flood. They're called dragons, and you look at the descriptions to see what they're talking about. But the word dinosaur wasn't coined until the 1840s. Okay, so dinosaurs didn't exist until the 1840s. Before that, the dinosaurs, really, if you look at the description, are these dragons. They're these legends of humans encountering these big creatures. So I would say that's historical evidence. And then you got physical evidence in the form of burial stones and figurines that have been, and drawings, petroglyphs and so forth that have been made over the millennia that go back hundreds of years, which amazingly are anatomically correct depictions. Even though, again, if you do any dinosaur excavation, you know it's rare for you to find a fully articulated dinosaur. We don't know what they look like until we gather evidence from other countries and put all this evidence together to figure out what, and even then you just got the bones. You don't know what that necessarily looked like on the outside without a lot more evidence accumulated, and people couldn't have done that in the past. And yet they're getting anatomically correct depictions of these creatures. And then, of course, you have biblical evidence in the form of the book of Job. I already showed you evidence that Job was probably describing. He lived after the flood, probably around the time of Abraham or just before. And again, I could do a whole session on this. And the description, the physiological description of behemoth is, in more ways than you realize, very similar to what a sauropod dinosaur is. It's not just its tail that's described as being like a tree. And good luck finding a creature whose tail you would describe as being like a tree. I mean, that's significant. But there's lots of other things in that description that don't fit the best that commentators have been able to come up with is being a hippo or something, or a mammoth. Those don't fit. But anatomically, it fits very well with the sauropod dinosaur, and they would have been around at that time period because this is just after the flood, than a few hundred years. All right, a lot more that we could say about that. Are some visuals used in the presentation available online or in the books? Um, yeah, so in my flooded book, you've got a lot of good illustrations in there, but the flooded book website, over here in teaching tools, you've got charts. And so some of these charts I had Rob go ahead and lay those out for me. I wanted to have good physical depictions. Like, for example, this cool chart here of of the geologic column, right? That gives you kind of where the various fossils show up and how you correlate that to the biblical perspective. Let's see what else is in here. A lot of the stuff from the flooded book. There's the catastrophic plate tectonics chart and the ice age chart. By the way, I got a picture in here. It was in the book, I think, of the Ark encounter. To give you an idea, so this huge group of people that went with me to the Ark are that tiny little group right there. That gives you an idea how big the Ark was. All right, what else is on here? Anyway, you get the idea. I blow up the Cenozoic layers within this chart. I take the yellow layers there and blow it up and show you more details in the Cenozoic, what's going on there, where the Ice Age fits in the layers. By the way, this is all stuff that the kids, if they go with me out to Arizona, we go deep and way deeper than the book. We go really deep into this stuff. Okay, that answers that question. We're moving too slow. We got to go faster. Advice to parents of children who want to pursue careers in science. How do we help them thrive in an overwhelmingly atheist and naturalistic view in that field? That is an extremely important question to me. And I've got two recommendations. Number one, get them in my flooded course when they're at least age 14, because that's my goal. And that course is to get them ready to answer anything that anybody's going to bring up. So if they fall away, it's not going to be because of some intellectual argument. It's going to have to be because of other things. That's my goal for that to be the case. And number two, when they're age 16, if they're going to go into the sciences, they can do an internship with me over the summer at AP, where we go even deeper into the specific area that they want to study in science and get them ready for that, see what creation scientists are doing, what the evolutionary scientists are going to say. And they even go with me to the creation conferences over the summer and even help me do field work when I go do my cave research, that sort of thing. So those things can bolster them very much in preparation for those years. That's so much of what I'm trying to do in my work is aimed at fixing that issue and preparing kids. Because statistically, 4 out of our 10 are leaving the church when they leave home. Okay, half of those 4 are going into the denominational world, which means they're not ready to deal with doctrinal issues. And the other half are becoming irreligious in large part due to this stuff we're talking about this weekend. They're not ready to deal with that. So they're becoming convinced about naturalism, and they're leaving the church because they didn't know there's answers. All right. Please explain how some in the church are being taught theistic evolution through the so-called gap and day-age theory. Okay, so I only touched on that a little bit, but the gap theory and the day-age theory have been developed to try to somehow compromise between what the Bible teaches and what modern evolutionary geology and biology are teaching. Okay, and if the two could be reconciled, great. If the Bible, let's say the Bible doesn't give enough information to know one way or the other, where it's just kind of, I think this, and I think this, okay, and we can just live together. That's fine. The problem is if the Bible gives enough information to know one way or the other, we've got to teach the truth on no matter what it is. Because the truth is truth. Doesn't matter how small it is. If God takes space in Scripture to make certain points that He wants us to know about, who are we to say, God, that point's not as important? I'm going to highlight this one over here. You can't do that. And instead, kids need to understand the world is going to think you're an idiot because of what you believe. Jesus already warned you that. They're going to scoff at you. Here, in fact, let me show you here. This is important. I think youth need to get this. There's something influential about a scoffer. I want young people to get this concept. I think that the scoffer is emphasized in the Bible because they don't really make an argument, but they make you feel like an idiot, and for some reason it makes you feel like you got to make a change in your thinking. And it's not based on anything logical. It's just I don't want to look like an idiot. Everybody think I'm a weirdo, and so I guess I better change my thinking. That's what scoffers do to you. And so you got to understand as a young person, that's going to happen, and you just need to accept it. That's part of what is required of you if you want to be holy, young people. Because most of the time, what holiness means, practically speaking, is you're going to be lonely. You just need to accept that. People are going to think you're a weirdo. And if they don't think you're a weirdo, you're probably not doing something right. Right? That's what Jesus basically taught. Now, notice what Peter says here. Starting in verse 3. Knowing this first. Know this. Scoffers are going to come in the last day. What are they going to scoff about? Okay, notice what he says here. They're walking according to their own lusts, by the way. They don't care anything about God. These are very immoral people. They want to sin and indulge the flesh. Okay? So what are they going to say to you? Where's the promise of His coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Uniformitarianism. The things that are going on right now, they've always gone on in that same basic way. And, that's ridiculous for you to think it was ever any different. And this, they willfully forget. God doesn't want us to forget the truth on this. The flood. The Word of God, the heavens were of old, the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. God says uniformitarianism is false, catastrophism is true, but they're going to scoff at you about that. You just need to be ready for it. They're going to think you're an idiot if you believe in a global flood. And yet you're going to feel compelled to change your thinking on that because you don't want to be an idiot around your friends. And you just need to get used to being comfortable with that. Do you think that I have many friends in the science community because of what I say? Young people? I don't. They scoff at me and think I'm an idiot, but they can't defeat what I'm saying. They can scoff all they want, but they can't defeat this. I'm ready if they will. Hey, I'm up for changing my thinking on something, but they just can't do it. They're not able to. You just need to get ready for that, young people. Stand with the truth no matter what. You imagine how many people scoffed at Noah? You imagine what that would have been like? Look at this guy over here spending decades building this boat. What an idiot. You can only imagine what people were saying to him. You're going to pay us to come help you build this? Yeah, okay, right. I'll take your money. Whatever. You can just imagine. And he's probably begging with them. All right, so I didn't get around to the gap in day age theory. All right, so the question then is, what does the Bible give you enough information to know if the day age theory and the gap theory are true? So what these ideas are is we got to try to find time to squeeze into the Bible somewhere. What if there is a gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2? In the beginning, at some point, millions of years ago, God made the heavens and the earth. And then a bunch of time passes. And then verse 2, now the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. Okay, so something happens in between there, and it causes the earth to become without form and void, like some kind of a big fight or something on Earth. That's basically what the gap theory says. All right, so does the Bible give enough information to know whether that happened? Right. The second big theory is called the day-age theory. And it's the idea that the days of Genesis 1 are not really literal days. They're figurative. They can be a long period of time. I mean, God kind of made the light. That's this kind of eon of time, 2 billion years. And then he does this over billions of years. So it's the idea that the days are not really days. And I really looked at that with you and showed you that the days, Moses does little things with the Hebrew that demands that these are normal days. Okay, like he uses the word yom and modifies it with numbers and uses evening and morning to help you see. And then in Exodus 20:11, he comes back and says, God does all of this, creates everything in 6 days. The Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in 6 days. Okay, but then you can jump outside of the Pentateuch. Think about the implications of what Jesus says, for example, in, where's my mouse? Mark 10:6. Let's go down here. Jesus says here, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. What's he talking about? Made them. Notice that the New King James guys put this in quotes because they realize he's quoting from Genesis. What does God talk when he makes them male and female? He's talking about the making of humans. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. So humans were created at the beginning of creation. That doesn't fit with evolution. You know where humans come onto the scene from an evolutionary perspective? The very end. Remember I showed you that big fossil record chart? Humans show up at the very top. Okay, so is Jesus wrong? Is this a big deal? Because if we say evolution is true, then Jesus is wrong about that. Are you comfortable saying that? I'm not comfortable saying that. Did Jesus just not know enough about evolutionary biology? All right, how about this one? I've heard people argue, well, maybe Adam and Eve were in the garden for a long time before they first sinned, you know? So maybe God creates them, they're there for millions of years, and they don't start to die until the first sin, and so that's when time starts becoming like reckoning, okay? There's several problems with that. Number one, Genesis 1:14, what is the purpose of God creating the stars? It's so humans can tell signs, seasons, days, and years, right? He creates the stars so that they can start counting years. And then Moses comes and tells you how many years Adam lived before he died. Okay, so you already have a problem there. But also notice so the first sin happens before Abel, right? But notice what Jesus says here. The blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. So Abel's blood is shed at the foundation of the world. And yet Abel's after the first sin. You see the problem here? Okay, they can't be around in Eden for very long because Abel's blood's not shed until after the first sin. And yet it's still considered to be at the foundation of the earth. You see, the Bible is in total harmony on all this. You can't squeeze this time from evolution in there. You can't do it, and you don't need to. It doesn't fit the evidence anyway. And we could do more. Romans 1:20 implies it too. All right, let's look at another one. So by the way, the gap and day-age theories aren't going to work because of these problems. We got a lot of material on our website that explore this stuff much deeper. Were people living during the Cambrian explosion? If so, is there physical evidence of this? So this really kind of goes along with what we said earlier. Yeah, the Cambrian explosion marks the beginning of the flood. So humans are around. The problem is they're apparently in a different habitat. So you've got to keep in mind that the flood is recording habitat destruction, not time period that everything is, what's on the earth at a certain time in the layer. So the evolutionists say the creatures we find in this layer, that's the only creatures that were alive at that time. That's not what we say. We say, no, there's lots of other creatures that aren't in those layers, even though they were alive at that time. It's because they weren't in that habitat, right? They're destroyed later in a different habitat. So that's why there's no physical evidence of them in the Cambrian, is because that wasn't their habitat. Why is there no evidence of human fossils in the fossil layers? That was that question too. How do we become different races when we became from Adam and Eve? Okay, let's see. Let's pull up some slides on this one. This is an important question that shows the stupidity of racism. Okay, scientifically, it's the dumbest thing ever. Okay, so Acts 17:26. By the way, some people have tried to argue that. I'm thinking about how much of this I want to go into. Some people have argued, well, could God have made other humans besides Adam and Eve? Okay, and one of the arguments they use for that is, if he didn't, then why is Cain concerned about his life when he gets sent off, right? After he kills Abel, and he's going to have, why is he worried about people trying to kill him? If God didn't create other humans out there. And one of the problems with that idea is this passage here. God made from one man every nation of mankind, and also Eve, remember, back in Genesis, is called the mother of all living. God only made Adam and Eve. So that's a different question. How do you explain why is Cain upset? And the answer to that is that a lot of time, there's indications in the text there that indicate a lot of time was passing before Cain killed Abel. They may have been 100 years old before it actually happened. It doesn't tell you how they were. You just kind of get it in your mind. These are like teenagers or college-age kids or something. But there's little indications. And it came to pass, little phrases like that tell you time is accumulating. So imagine a person that is 100 years old today. How many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren do they have? How big is their family? Especially if there's no holes barred on how many kids they can have, and God wants them to have a lot of kids, be fruitful and multiply. There can be a lot. I mean, what's that show called, 63 and Counting, whatever it is, that show that was on where people are just having tons of babies. Anyway, I forget what that's called. But anyway, you can have a lot. And so Cain is probably very concerned about his relatives and what they think about what he did to their oldest brother, or to Abel anyway. All right, so anyway, we know that God made from Adam and Eve every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. So how do we do that? Now, ironically, here's what Darwin said. A lot of people don't realize that the actual name of the origin of species, they like to cut off the second half. Here's the actual title of his book: The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You understand what he's saying? Evolution is a racist idea. What Darwin said is, humans have evolved too, and humans continue to evolve, and the ultimate high race of humans is the Caucasian. And so we're the favored race, and eventually all the other races aren't going to make it. Natural selection is going to eliminate them. Right? And so his ideas, guess what they then became? They became Nazism and so forth. It was his ridiculous ideas based on evolutionary thinking that drove that kind of mentality. So anyway, evolution, is the racist idea, but the biblical model says we're all family here. we're all family. We're just maybe distant in some cases. So first of all, how do you define what a race is? This is already a loaded term. But usually what people mean is a group of people with certain features in common, usually physical features, that distinguish them from some other group of people, okay? And so with that definition, people have historically said that there's really four main races: the Caucasoid, the Mongoloid, Negroid, and the Australoid races. So how do you get these common characteristics that show up in various groups? And these distinctions, are can come down to things like hair texture and skin color and facial features, but there's all kinds of other things too. Gland structure and earwax and teeth and body shape and metabolism and brain size. There's all kinds of things that go into this. But as an example of how you can get such varied characteristics from just two people. So let's take, for example, just skin color. And we're going to break this down real simple. It's more complicated than this, but this is going to be very simplified. Skin color is actually based on, I think, 6 genes and other different factors, but this can give you the right idea anyway. So skin color as well as hair and eye color is controlled by the pigment known as melanin. So the more melanin you have, the darker is going to be your skin, okay? And that's controlled, let's say, by 2 pairs of genes. And we'll call them pairs of A and pairs of B. And big A is dominant, so it's going to produce melanin well. Little a is recessive, so it produces melanin to a lesser degree. So each human has A and B pairs in his genes, okay? Now, this is called a Punnett square, and this is what geneticists can use to predict the probability outcomes when various genetic characteristics are bred together. And this shows, for example, the possible skin colors that you could get from breeding certain gene pairs. So if Adam and Eve both had only dominant A and dominant B genes, then all of their children would be very dark colored. They would have a lot of melanin, right? If they only had recessive genes, their children would have been the lightest possible. Okay? All of their children would ultimately be that very light type of color. But if they were heterozygous and they're more middle brown in color and have a mixture, 1 pair dominant, 1 recessive, then you have this entire square on the screen as possibilities. So if Adam and Eve had those pairs of genes and happened to have 16 kids, the odds say that in 1 generation, their children could have had this entire mixture of white to black children. All right, imagine that. A 38% chance that their children are going to be their same middle brown color, 16% chance that they'll be darker brown, 16% chance lighter and pinkish, 6% of either being extremely dark or extremely light. So at the Tower of Babel, the various family clans would have been separated, and within those gene pools, various colors would start to gain dominance because there's no longer as much intermarriage with heterozygous options. And so certain traits start to become dominant. And you apply the same principle to every other physical characteristic. And as long as you have those groups sequestered, you start having certain features that all just keep popping up in a group until you start remixing it with the others. And then you have cool things that happen. That's basically what happens in America. It's this melting pot of these different groups. So let me give you an example. My adopted brother, Chris, is half black, half white. He married a girl who's half white, half Asian, half Korean. And this is their kids. Right? 5 biological kids. And notice the differences here. I mean, you got it all in all kinds of interesting mixtures of all these different characteristics. These children would be half white, 1/4 Asian, 1/4 black. Right? And the variety you get by just mixing the genes from these two people, right? So just imagine what would be the case whenever you go back to how God originally made the genome. All right, fun stuff. So racism is stupid. Okay? It just is. It's dumb. Anybody that's racist, you're not scientific and you're not biblical. So stop it. How about that? That's none of us, right? I hope. All right, how do you account for the old ages of people before the flood, being that the canopy theory is not considered true? Also, doesn't the canopy theory explain why tropical animals are quick frozen in ice? So in the last question, the tropical animals quick frozen in ice is probably talking about like the woolly mammoths, and they're post-flood, okay? So the canopy theory wouldn't have anything to do with that. So they're up in the Pleistocene, the Ice Age layers, which are way after the flood. But old ages of people before the flood, how do we explain that? And again, I think I touched on that briefly, but there's lots of factors that I'm sure are at play. The human genome being more pristine, closer to the way God originally created it, possibly the lingering effects from the tree of life, higher oxygen content. The magnetic field of the Earth was a lot stronger at that point, which would have helped to shield the Earth more. There was more carbon dioxide in the air, which would create something of a greenhouse effect. Less mutation in the genome because of, for example, the radiation that was probably released during the flood. All these factors and probably others that we don't even know yet will come to light. Okay. Could the light of Genesis 1:3 have been Christ? That doesn't fit because of what he says happens with this light. God starts dividing it day and night, calls it day and night, and has an evening and morning for that first day. That first day. So this doesn't fit as being Christ. This is talking about literal things that are going on with regard to this light. Did any of the sea creatures survive the flood? We talked about that. Why no pre-flood human fossils found? I'm glad a lot of people had that question. All right, I think you answered all that. What about microevolution? Okay, that's a good question because I wouldn't want young people to think just flat out that we don't believe in evolution. Richard Dawkins said, if anybody tells you that they don't believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. That's what he came out and said. And so that's the kind of scoffing you're going to get. But really what he means is, yeah, we actually all do believe in evolution. I do too. You just have to define your term. Okay, are you the same as your parents? No? You're a little bit different. Okay, you evolved. Okay, as long as that's what you're talking about, that's microevolution. We're talking about variety that is created within the same kind. Okay, that's microevolution. Now the question, what Darwin said is, if you do a lot of microevolution, it'll add up into macroevolution, where you can have this kind of creature totally turn into something else, and you can have a dinosaur turn into a bird, and you can have a fish start growing little arms, and it starts flopping out on the land and turn into an animal that can walk around. I mean, that's what Darwin was saying. That's different. As a whole, that's what we call macroevolution, which the evidence does not support. It takes a blind faith because that would require an enormous amount of genetic information to be added to the genome, and there is no known natural way to do that. But microevolution is just variety within a kind. Like, for example, the different races. That's microevolution. But the minute you start saying that an ape can turn into a human, now you've gone beyond microevolution. You've gone beyond what microevolution can do. The technical term is you've gone beyond the veritable, the heritable variation that can occur through your offspring. That's the technical term that they'll use. Like, for example, when they study Darwin's finches at the Galapagos Islands, which you'll hear about in your biology courses. The guys that go study that, and they look at all the variety happening, like within the finches, they realize, oh wow, there's all this change that's gone on with the finches. But guess what? They're all still finches. There's just a lot of variety of finches. Okay, that's microevolution. We don't have a problem with that. That's not an unbiblical idea. The problem is that the parents have to have the variety within their genomes already to produce all that variety. The question is, where did that variety come from? That's the genetic information. And there is no known natural way to get new genetic information. So you have to have a supernatural way to get it. That's what's demanded by the evidence. So microevolution is not a problem. It's the macroevolution that is a problem. So Darwin was the issue there. All right. Let's see here. I think we're in good shape here. Are there any other questions that have been that you've thought of since I've been, or have I just answered every question that you've ever had? By the way, just very quickly, somebody asked a question about suffering. And I would just say that is a huge subject, like the meaning of why suffering happens and so forth. And there's so much that could be said about that. It's used as the big argument against God. And we have a book that delves into this subject, that why people suffer. That helps you to see all that, suffering can be due to other people's sin that causes suffering on us. And God can't eliminate that without taking away their free will, right? So one of the endemic things of the created order is free will, okay? God has to give us free will, or you don't have the choice to choose to follow him or not. You become a robot. So that would not be loving a God. He's got to give us free will. But part of free will is you have to be willing, you have to be able to make the decision to hurt somebody or not. That's part of your free will. So he can't make it where you can't hurt somebody else without taking away your free will. You no longer have the freedom to hurt somebody if he makes it where you can't be hurt. You see what I'm saying? So that sometimes you get hurt because of other people's actions. Sometimes you get hurt because of your own actions. Sometimes you get hurt because God's like, hey, you need a spanking. Hebrews 12 makes that clear. God spanks his kids whenever they misbehave. By the way, it's a New Testament, corporal punishment there. Not capital punishment, but corporal punishment. Sometimes you might want to commit, Anyway, the Bible has a lot of things to say about this suffering question, and none of them disprove God. In fact, it could be argued that if God, I think we talk about this tomorrow, but I'm not even going to get into this because we talk about this tomorrow. All right, question.
That suffering question was mine.
Okay.
The part that I put on there, I've had a lot of surgeries.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the suffering of healing, does that represent some suffering that Jesus went through on the cross? Do you get what I'm saying?
I do not.
What I'm saying is, when somebody goes through physical pain, is that something that God is using to teach us or teach me something?
That could definitely be the case, at least in the Hebrews 12 example of God's disciplining. It is used he says, to bring about the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So suffering can be for that purpose. That's why it gets complicated. It depends upon what specific suffering, that we're talking about. But the bottom line about suffering is that it is essential to improve us. Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about a lot tomorrow. That's an important concept within Christianity.
Okay, the second part of that is in Job, when Satan and the angels went to God, and God said, have you seen my servant Job, how faithful he is to me? And Satan said, well, just do something to him, and he'll curse it to your face. And God said to Satan, okay, more or less to say, I'll give you the power, but don't kill him. Now, does God give Satan the power to give us suffering?
Well, based on that passage, that is one way suffering can happen, right? Because we then see how that plays out. I mean, the things Satan does. And it's interesting that they are not supernatural suffering. Like from Job's perspective, there wasn't anything supernatural about it. It would have just seemed like the natural, like, wow, this is a weird coincidence, all these things happening, one thing after the other. But based on that passage, God is allowing Satan to do that, but he just has him on a leash the whole time. That's the important thing. From a Christian perspective, God only allows suffering, the amount of suffering, to come on you that he's okay with. So that's the comforting thing to us. Ultimately, of course, what's the worst that can happen? We die. Yay! Right? You know, that was the crazy thing about this whole COVID thing is how many Christians I saw that were like, oh no, we're going to die. I'm like, yay, we're going to die. Right? I mean, that's the Christian perspective. What are we worried about? I mean, don't we want to go to the next place? I'm dying to go there, literally. Right? Anyway, the only reason I'm still here is because I have to be. Yes, sir.
My question kind of goes back to where you said within the flood layers that it was mostly going by habitat. Um, it goes back in with the dinosaurs. Were the dinosaurs pre-flood not associated with humans in the way that they were after flood, which could explain why there's that clear break of you have all these dinosaurs and there's not humans, but then after there's, the hieroglyphs of the.
Yes, exactly. You're thinking about that right. So, and all we're doing is looking at the physical evidence. The physical evidence says the pre-flood world. We look at the fossil record. All the dinosaurs are dying, and there's no the larger mammals, and the humans are not with them. Okay, so they're living apparently separately. The humans aren't mixing in with them. But after the flood, all of a sudden we have all this interaction going on because we've got accounts of that. So that tells you how it is now is different than it was then. There must have been a sequestering of habitats. That's kind of what I get out of that.
But if, like you said, the dinosaurs that were brought into the ark were infants, so to speak, and were babies, could their interactions with humans be different based on that because they were kind of raised by Noah, so to speak? So they wouldn't be as aggressive towards, as they're depicted.
Okay, so
Side by.
so you gotta distinguish what they would have been like, before the flood. Of course, they're not apparently interacting with humans. We really don't even know exactly how they behave. Well, we can see how they behaved at least starting in the flood because that's where their fossils show up, and we find them to be very violent, at least during the flood. After the flood, you get that little hint that they're now going to fear humans. All the animals are. But they obviously spread out very quickly. So, Noah's not just raising these guys. Okay, they leave quickly. And the reason, and by the way, the fossil record is very interesting about this. Let me see if I can pull up this chart here. Okay, so this is the post-flood rock layers. Okay, so the flood ends down here, right? This is the beginning of the Cenozoic. And right off the bat, the creatures spread out across the planet. But no humans show up right here for a while after the flood. And you can think through why would that be? Because the humans hadn't spread out yet. They're disobeying God. So the only place you would find human fossils would be where? Babel. If there happened to be a catastrophic fossil forming event that happened at Babel, that's where you would find them. Then all of a sudden, in the Pleistocene, humans, boom, explode across the planet. It seems to radiate out from the Middle East. And you find the hominids go out everywhere. Okay, isn't that interesting? So they radiate out. So that tells you apparently all of this is post-flood, pre-Babel sediment that is continuing to be deposited really probably in 100 years' time. So you still got a lot of catastrophic conditions going on as the earth is calming down after the flood. Now, what did that have to do with your question? I've lost it, forgotten. There was it was somehow tied. What did you ask? I don't remember what you asked.
I guess just how their interactions with humans.
Oh, yeah. So they spread out. They leave like they're supposed to, because the animals do what God tells them to do. Like, yes, sir, we'll obey. Here we go. And the humans are like, I don't think I will. And God's like, boom, yes, you will. And then they spread out too, right? So the dinosaurs, they're spreading out already down here. And interestingly, there's when you trace down start trying to correlate the stories and the artifacts, the more recent artifacts that we find where humans apparently saw these alive are way away from the Middle East. And so I would suspect that any of the the creatures, they spread out, but the humans are still around that area, and so they're wiping out whatever's in that area. And so the oldest dragon legends are there in the Middle East, where they're facing whatever dinosaurs are still in the area. But the rest spread out, and they start probably getting into remote areas and getting their dominance in those areas before the humans get there. And so until the humans ultimately finally get to those places and run across them, you don't see as many legends. And then they start popping up. Some of them are, coming out of places way off, away from the Middle East, where finally humans interact with them in some of these remote areas. So you'll see some of this, for example, down in Peru, right? Some of our stuff, some goes all the way. I mean, so imagine, you think of the world map, what has to happen for humans to get down to Peru and potentially interact with the species that have populated that area. That's a long ways. Okay, they got to go apparently across the Bering Strait and then go all the way down North America and then down to Latin America and then all the way down into South America and humans have to become dominant down there. That's a huge area with massive forests and so forth before humans start seeing and interacting with the things that got there way before they did, hundreds of years probably before they did. Mm-hmm. What else we got? Nope, one over here.
All right. Hopefully this isn't too far off from creation, but since you're here, I'm going to take advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I don't claim to know everything here. So what I'm trying to do is give you what I think where we're at in creation science. And it's a lot of this is very theoretical, everybody. So.
All right. Thank you. Well, you mentioned free will. So oftentimes I've heard Calvins mock Bible-believing Christians when they say God has a plan. So where do we draw the line in free will and what's God's plan when conversing with those of another denomination or that belief?
So can you give me an example of kind of conversation you're talking about?
I guess if something happens in a Christian's life, whether someone passed or maybe they won something, whether it's negative or positive, oftentimes Christians will say, well, it was God's plan for that to happen to you, whether it was negative or positive. And then I'll hear this Calvin put this meme online saying that we don't believe that, our souls are predestined from birth, but yet we'll say this is God's plan. That's the reference in which I've seen it and read it and heard it.
Okay. So I'm confused about that because, staunch Calvinists would be more that way. That's what I'm kind of confused about. What? Oh. So they're being more like sarcastic about it. Okay. Well, I guess all I can say on that is just to teach what the Bible really teaches on it. We know that God will providentially bring about. He's got a plan, but He can change it. He does change it based on our prayers and so forth. The problem is that whenever we have to be real careful about stating with certainty things that we don't really know are God's plan. Christians need to be careful about that. If we come out and say, "Oh, well, that was just God's plan," I think you got to be careful about that because sometimes things happen that are not really God's plan. It's not something He wants to happen. He wasn't planning for that. It's not God's plan if somebody came in here and necessarily shot all of us. It's not necessarily God's plan. And so, yes, God can have a providential plan. We've got to be really careful how we state that. We can state things with conditional statements like, maybe that was God's plan. But remember, that was more Mordecai's way of handling this in Esther's life. Hey, maybe you were put here for just such a time as this. He didn't state that with certainty. And so I think Christians have to be careful about that. And I definitely see that in the denominational world, that kind of terminology that is stated with certainty, as though they're just certain that God worked this out in their life. Well, I think you got to be real careful about that. The nature of providence is such that it's not miraculous. See, a miracle you know that it's from God. That's part of what makes it a miracle. Nobody can question this had to be from God. That's why it establishes. So if a prophet said, "Hey, here's this truth from God," oh well, who are you? How do we know that's really from God? Boom! He does a miracle and nobody can question it. That's the purpose of the miracle. It confirms the message. But providence doesn't work that way. Because we got to be careful stating things with certainty, otherwise it becomes a miracle. And miracles don't happen today. Okay, so providence is more God working through the natural order, and all we can speak with that stuff is with regard to uncertainty. So I guess that's all I can say on that. I don't know if that answers your question.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
There was a question over here. Sorry. Is there any chart that shows how many years are within each layer on the fossil chart?
Let's see here. Well, there is the general one over here that I do. I nail this down, but it's more the general categories. So, for example, the Precambrian in radiometric years, so evolutionary years, this is 541 million years ago, back to the age of the Earth, 4.6 million years. Now you convert that, though, to our time frame, and this is basically pre-flood, post-creation. These are thousands of years. Then the flood starts, and in radiometric years, that is 66 million years ago to 541 million years ago. But to us, that's the biblical flood. This is 1 year of sediment accumulation. And then the present back to 66 million years. Now, then when you look at starting in the Cenozoic, I have kind of an estimate chart here that tries to correlate how this would fit with radiometric years. Well, I told y'all that there's what appears to be the nuclear decay rates are still accelerated at the end of the flood, 66 million years ago radiometrically, which correlates to 2500 BC for us. And everything is still amplified, continuing, and you can't even see it here, but it's actually still amplified until it gets to about right here. And that's when, well, even closer, somewhere right in here, all of a sudden the carbon dating and radiometric dating starts matching with the biblical record. So that tells you there's still inflated nuclear decay going on. So what I have here is some correlations that give you kind of an idea. Babel would be 2.6 million years ago radiometrically, approximately. The Ice Age basically starts there, goes to about 11,700 BC, which is before Abram. Abraham is like roughly 2000 BC. Radiometrically, that's about 5,000 BC. So if you hear like in radiometric, like carbon dating, things that are dating to say 5,000 BC, that to us is basically the time of Abraham. This would be kind of where we're at whenever I talk to Kurt Wise about this. This is, I think, kind of what we think is going on there.
And if somebody wanted to see the charts at home, is this just a link on the Apologetics
Yeah,
website?
so this is floodedbook.org. Okay, so this is, again, this is supposed to be, if you get the book, there's supposed to be a slip of paper in there that kind of tells you where to go to get for this, but it's just floodedbook.org. And there's all kinds of sources here of information for helping you teach this to kids. Again, we even have a site where they can take quizzes and how to teach this, including papers they can write and so forth. The answers to the chapter questions that are in the book, vocabulary lists in the order that they come in the book. So if you're teaching through the book, what are the terms they need to know for each chapter, that kind of thing. So I put a lot of time into this. I even developed little short videos that go with each chapter that go in a little bit deeper into some of the topics. Like here's one on the fossil record for that chapter. And anyway, a lot of information there to add to the flooded book. What else we
Brother
got?
Jeff, thank you for
Yes, sir.
teaching us all these things and the knowledge you have passed on to us.
Yes,
My
sir.
question I have for you today is the Grand Canyon. We can see through all the sedimentary layers that there was great erosion. And my question is, do you believe, was that from the receding floodwaters from the flood, with the submarine canyons, or could it have been from the the global freezing of a lake that was formed that may have broke over and carved that out?
Okay. So the origin of the Grand Canyon is it is a big debate among creation geologists, but the bulk of creation geologists for the last 3 to 4 decades have all been in pretty much agreement, really, that the Grand Canyon was formed from the erosion of 3 lakes that were caught basically up on the Colorado Plateau during the Ice Age period that breached like dominoes and flooded the Grand Canyon area and totally eroded all that. There are a couple geologists in the last few years that are saying, we think this is erosion from the flood, part of the recession. And ultimately, the debate there has to do with where you put the end of the flood, whether you push it up higher from above the Cretaceous and move it on up into the Cenozoic. And there's major problems if you do that. And so the guy that I consider to be kind of the expert on the Grand Canyon literally wrote the textbook on it for creationists. He's pushing back and showing and substantiating this lake concept on the Colorado Plateau, and he's presenting that at the creation conferences, and it's compelling. And I'm not seeing the other guys be able to deal with his arguments. So I'm still thinking that these are the Ice Age period is what erodes the Grand Canyon. Yeah.
Dr. Miller, your fossilization chart.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think about architecture or archaeological digs, where are the majority of archaeological digs in the world? How many archaeological digs have taken place where civilization would have been right after the flood?
Okay, so what is that? Are you talking about this fossilization? You're probably not talking about this fossilization chart, I'm guessing. I'm just going to go in a different direction. So you don't mean this fossilization process chart here, I'm assuming. What fossil chart are you talking about?
When you were talking about the layers and what fossils have been found in the layers,
Mm-hmm.
that's all based on archaeological digs and that data from those digs. My question is, and maybe it's wrong of me to think this, that there's more archaeological digs in our own country than there are over in the Middle East.
I don't know the percentage, but so there's 2 different things. So archaeology is the digs where they're looking for human artifacts, okay, from the last few thousand years. Paleontology digs, that's different. That's kind of 2 different things. Paleontology is when you're looking for ancient fossils that really go back before archaeology starts. Is how the secular world really would view that. Really, there's an overlap from the creationist perspective. But so if you're talking about the fossils, you really mean the paleontology digs. And that for paleontology, the place that you tend to find fossils is where there's outcrops of places like creek beds, where you've got these layers and something is eroded through them, where there's now these layers exposed and the fossils start hanging out. So you find those everywhere, okay? And so then it's just somebody documenting what they found in each creek bed. And so we've got, I think, a pretty good, look at what the kind of fossils are in each layer, as long as you can correlate that layer, over long distances. And that's what they're trying to do. Now, that's not to say that they don't continue to find other fossils that pop up in certain layers as new creek beds are made, or there's some creek bed maybe that they hadn't investigated yet, that kind of a thing. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I have a question over here. How you doing? Over here.
Yeah. Oh, it's funny because the sound is kind of coming out over here. It's like, yes.
I'm over there. I'm getting so old, I almost forgot my question. But anyway,
I do that a lot. So.
I come from Long Island. Now,
I'm
Long
sorry to hear
Island,
that.
According to the evolution, you're sorry about that. So am I. And I came from the Bronx before that's even worse.
Oh,
So it supposedly was formed by the glaciers moving down and forming Long Island, which is just a big pile of sand. Okay, now the Ice Age and the glaciers, I always believed, was the evolutionists' explanation for the flood in place of the flood.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're saying then that the glaciers did take place
Mm-hmm.
and did form Long Island, the question comes up.
So, by the
And-
way,
and-
this is just to kind of, before you move on. So here's our flood layers from down here to, so down here to right here. And then when we blow this yellow area up, that is this right here. Oh, not that. This. And notice the Ice Age layers are right here. Okay, so they're even further up in the Cenozoic. So that is where you find these frozen mammoths and so forth. This is clearly post-flood.
Okay.
And so in those Cenozoic layers is where you're going to find the Ice Age evidence. So that is, I'm sure, what they're weighing in on.
So the point I was going to ask is, and I'm willing to adjust all my thinking from before. I'm willing to do that. The first thing was that the mammoths were quick frozen. I remember Bert Thompson and others talking about that. That's 30, 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Things change, but that they were quick frozen and still you can even trade their ivory, their genetics, their meat is still quick frozen, and they're good swimmers. So how did they drown? Blah, blah, blah. In upright positions and so on. And that glaciers don't move quickly. They move in a matter of, inches per year? So how does something get caught in a glacier and quick frozen in a glacier that's moving a couple inches, you can't step out of the way?
Mm-hmm.
And if they're moving that slowly, why aren't there still glaciers moving down? And do we not see them today? That formed even in North America, Long Island, for example, or across the Grand Canyon or just north of the Grand Canyon. So
Yeah.
that's my question.
So the way that the Ice Age happens is you've got to be able to grow the glacier through more precipitation. You've got to have more snow, which means you got to have more evaporation first. So the oceans have to be warmer. You got to warm the entire ocean. That causes more snow and precipitation, so the glacier grows. And then summer comes around. And so you can't have too much melting or you go back the other direction, which is what we have now. So the only way to keep it growing is for that to continue, where you have way more precipitation, and the summers have to be cooler where there's less melting. So you need some kind of cover, volcanic cover, for example, to cool off your summers a little bit. So that's what's going on. Eventually the glaciers then will expand down to even New York and beyond. Okay, and then once the ocean cools and the volcanic aerosols move out of the way, now the glaciers start moving. They start compacting, compressing, and moving back towards the north, which is what's happening now. Which, by the way, I'm surprised nobody asked about this whole global warming thing. Global warming, creation scientists would say that there's really not much debate over whether the Earth is warming. We take the temperature of the Earth and it seems to be warming. Where the debate is what's causing that, number one, whether humans are even the primary cause of that, and there's lots of evidence that they're not. And number two, even if we were, whether that would be a bad thing. Because more people, for example, die from cold than warmth every year. And so what creationist thing is going on with the glaciers expanding and contracting and so forth, we think that the Earth is moving back towards the pre-flood climate, that we're basically still recuperating from the flood. and that the pre-flood climate may not have even had glaciers. And so essentially that may be where we're headed to go back, in which case, why would that be a bad thing? It wouldn't probably be a good thing for you, as you're right here on the coast, but but probably your beaches need to be cleaned a little bit, if you know what I mean. I'm sure you all go out there and see some of the wickedness that probably needs to be cleaned up a little bit. Anyway, did I answer your question? Oh, the quick freezing, yeah. So why was there quick freezing? Is that what you're asking? I think you have to picture these kind of snowstorms that'll just hit really fast, and even in one night, freeze something and, I mean, bury it quickly. Even humans, where humans are walking along and they just freeze, and you find them frozen. Maybe they're going through really deep snow, and they just die, and they're in the deep snow, and so they're even kind of standing up. They're just kind of there. And then people start digging down and find them, and they're standing up frozen. That can be the kind of situation you're talking about. At least that's the kind of conditions in the Ice Age we're talking about. You've got that kind of catastrophic blizzards going on. I don't remember. You're saying some of these mammoths? Okay. What about it? I would assume that's what they're saying. Where did the glaciers go? So they would have contracted back up north, right? Yeah, through melting. Now the creationist that developed the Ice Age model from a creationist perspective. He's a meteorologist named Mike Ord, and there's a book that he wrote that I'd recommend called it's called Frozen in Time. Anyway, come and ask me about that. I'll tell you. Get this book, read it, and it has the mammoths on the front and everything. So he spends some time looking at that specific question. I think you'll enjoy checking that out. Yeah, ask me right after. I can't remember if it's Frozen in Time or the Frozen Record or something. Anyway, I read the book. It was a good book.
I know, or at least I've heard, and you can verify or correct, but the image that we see of the primate becoming the man, there's no actual evidence for the evolutionary things that we see on the graphic.
Right.
Confirm that, and then maybe share any other common visuals that our kids might see in school or we might see online that you haven't covered already that would be lies that we may not realize.
Let's see here. I think here. This is the first thing I'd recommend. This is a relatively short video, 11 minutes, that goes through the general characteristics of the fossil record in 11 minutes. I've got a much more extensive video that goes much more deeply. It's probably 45-minute long on the fossil record that shows quotes from leading paleontologists. But kind of the Cliff Notes version, here's where they're at. There are 3 sweeping traits of the fossil record according to evolutionists: abrupt appearance, stasis, and extinction. And this is not some weird exceptional thing. This characterizes the fossil record from bottom to top, young people. Abrupt appearance means the creatures appear abruptly without any evolutionary history. Then stasis, that means they stay the same, and then they go extinct. That is the 3 sweeping characteristics of the fossil record. It's exactly what we would think should be the case, and it's exactly what they would say shouldn't be the case. They abruptly appear, they don't evolve, they stay the same, and then they go extinct. Now, evolution would say the creature should go extinct in favor of the next species. That's not what we're talking about. The problem is that there are 5 worldwide extinctions that happen in the fossil record that are not just, individuals going extinct. No, these are like something happens where, say, 85% of the species on the planet go extinct. Okay, now that's not uniformitarianism. That suggests something catastrophic going on the earth. And there's 5 of those. Okay, so that, again, fits our model. Now, we wouldn't say there was 5 different extinction events. What's really going on is all those extinctions are in the flood layers. So what's happening is the flood starts wiping out these habitats, and all of a sudden it gets to the end of one big habitat, and that registers to an evolutionist as an extinction event. What that means to us is that habitat's wiped out. Almost all of the creatures in that habitat are gone. And then it moves to the next one. And you got 5 of these huge big blocks in the flood layers where these big habitats just get obliterated. So abrupt appearance, stasis, extinction, even mass extinction is what characterizes the fossil record. And again, it fits with the flood model. It's a major problem with the evolutionary model. And all they can say, in fact, Stephen Jay Gould is probably the leading evolutionary paleontologist of the 20th century. He's a Harvard paleontologist. The guy that I studied with, Kurt Wise, was one of his students. And Kurt Wise told me from just studying under Stephen Jay Gould and what his studies involved. Stephen Jay Gould considered the Cambrian explosion such a problem for evolution. The fact that all these creatures show up without any evolutionary history, that he spent his life trying to come up with an explanation to figure out how you just have that, not even just the Cambrian explosion, but it'll happen over and over and over throughout the fossil record where creatures just boom, show up abruptly and then stay the same and disappear. And he died without having a good explanation. The best option he had is called punctuated equilibrium. Okay, and you're thinking, oh, well, I don't know what that word means, so it must be true. And I think a lot of young people think the same thing. I call it magical equilibrium because what he's talking about is this creature shows up, it stays the same, and then it disappears, but we think this creature is what it turned into. We don't see any evidence that it did, so it had to happen really fast. And so the fossil record doesn't show that it happened, but we know that it did. And so his idea was most of the time evolution doesn't happen. You're in a state of equilibrium. And those states of equilibrium are punctuated by rapid evolution that happens so fast that we don't even know how it could happen. There is no known mechanism to make it happen. There's no evidence in the fossil record that it did happen, but we know this has to turn into this, so it must happen. That's punctuated equilibrium. That's why I call it magical equilibrium. It's not based on evidence. It's based on evolution has to be true, and I'm not going to accept anything else. So it really doesn't matter what the evidence says. So it's a pure blind faith. It's amazing to me that and I've got lots of great quotes from Stephen Jay Gould. He's a gold mine for that. And here he is, the leading paleontologist of the 20th century, and he was vocal about the problems. And punctuated equilibrium is the best he could come up with.
Can you explain how fossils are formed and answer, are they happening today? And if not, why not?
Okay. Look at this cool chart that's on here, which is in the book, by the way. In fact, let's see here. Look at this. I even have a flip chart in here. For those of you all that care about those. I'm sure a lot of teachers care about that. All right. All right. So to form a fossil, and maybe this needs to be our last question. I know it's already 5 o'clock. To form a fossil, you've got to bury. Okay, so first of all, what happens if an animal dies today? Okay, roadkill. You drive over a animal on the way home. Is it going to turn into a fossil? And the answer is no, right? Because organisms come and eat it, and microorganisms, so forth. Vultures or whatever, will come and chew on it, and so forth. So you have to have very special circumstances to fossilize something. First thing you have to do is have some kind of event that will rapidly bury this creature deep under a lot of sediment so that it's totally kept away from oxygen anything that is going to start deteriorating. It's got to be kept away from burrowing organisms, which will get down there and want to. So, like for example, if you dig down in your backyard, you don't see those pristine layers, right? Like you see at the Grand Canyon, where it's like there's these distinct layers. Why don't you see that? Well, it's because what's called bioturbation. The organisms in your backyard, if they're allowed to just do their thing, and the trees with their roots, it churns up all that dirt and makes it one just big homogeneous blah of stuff. Which, by the way, the fact that the Grand Canyon has these distinct layers means they had to have been deposited so fast that there wasn't time for bioturbation to happen. Because that's what happens normally, is all those layers get totally obliterated by the organisms. Okay? So you've got to be buried deep enough that the organisms aren't going to get in there and mess up your specimen. Okay, so then it's down there, and it's still going to continue decaying a little bit. So here it is, covered up with material. It's going to continue decaying, especially the soft materials are going to decay away and leave the harder materials, and so that's basically going to be your bones. And then again, if you've got it deeply compacted in there, what happens is water gradually starts trickling down through the dirt. And in that water, it's going to have substances in it, okay? And the little chasms are being made from deterioration in these bones, and it's happening slow enough that as the water trickles down in there, the materials that are in the water fills those holes. Okay, so what was part of the bone now has washed away, and it's getting filled up with new minerals from the water that's trickling down. Okay, and then eventually the whole and it's usually going to be the hardest parts because the rest of it is going to continue to deteriorate too quickly. So that's why the hardest parts are usually what you find. But then eventually the entire bone that's there gets totally replaced with the minerals from this water that is trickling down. So when you then find the creature, you're not really finding the creature, right? You're finding a replica that has been made by water that filled in gaps. You're basically finding casts and molds of the original creature. And then eventually it'll get uncovered where you can actually find it. So this is called permineralization. And the question is, how fast can that happen? And so I showed you that this is something we found can happen really fast. That process. There's a lot of things that play a role in how fast that can happen, but this isn't something that takes some slow process. So then you asked, is this something that is happening today? It's rare today. That was one of the things that's proof that the fossil record is basically the flood, because there's not enough catastrophic activity today to make this happen much. The conditions that are necessary to make it happen were perfect in the flood, but not so much today. Okay, we probably should stop, right? You all have had more questions than anybody I've ever had in any seminar I've ever done. And we got more. We got more coming. All right, you want to take over here, Mr. Steve? I've been talking so long, this has become really hot.
For what you shared with us the last 2 days, it's been fantastic. And the reason why you had so many questions today, I tell everybody, this is a very special people we have here. They really are. And to come out here and support this, you told me last couple of days you've been so joyful about the numbers that have come out. It's because they're very special people. And you're a very special teacher. Thank you. Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much for this seminar, Father, and so much information, Father, that has just uplifted our faith and given us tools to help others, Father, to see the wonderful Creator and creation and the logic of it and the faith in it. And this, Father, help us to go home and look forward to tomorrow, Father. We can worship together and hear Him 2 more times, Father, and just keep us safe. And thank you for all that came out today. So I pray in Christ's name. Amen. God bless you all. That's right. Move your clock up 1 hour.